Hello and welcome to this edition of our self-help segment. I'm your host, Keith Whiteside, licensed clinical social worker, joined by my colleague and friend, Father Willie Todd. Father, thanks for being here.
Good to be here. Good to
I
be here.
appreciate it. You know, Father, we spend a lot of time talking about how to get better at things, but I always like to maybe go back and figure out maybe how and why people do what they do.
Right.
And a couple of weeks ago, we kind of inadvertently talked about the different developmental theories that Piaget and Kohlberg had.
Right.
So again, thanks for that clarification.
Okay.
My brain gets a little muddled sometimes. And, I said Coleman, but there's a Coleman Lannert, but a Kohlberg theory of moral development. And these developmental stages, it's interesting to me. And I thought we'd talk about a couple of those.
Right.
And so just general thoughts, first and foremost, about why that's interesting for you.
Well, I think it's interesting to me because once you put all this together, the Piaget Kohlberg, and you see it's like stages in the spiritual life that people go through. We all go through them, and why I realize it. But hardly anybody ever reaches the top stage, and it's a shame because we'll see why. Because we all should try to do what needs to be done and the best way, you know. So a lot of times people get hung up in one of the stages, and so. But anyway, for the development of our spiritual lives and our moral lives, it doesn't make it what religion you are. I mean, that's the other thing too. I mean, it's not. You can apply it to Catholicism, Judaism, Mohammedanism, whatever. You know, I mean, that doesn't make any difference. It's the same values that we all grow with.
Right.
And Piaget and Kohlberg just identified and helped us out to see what we're doing.
Right, and how we do that. So I'd like to kind of talk about Piaget for a little bit, and starting with it. And he identified 4 stages. He really focused a lot of those on the children, like child development, and those are more of the cognitive developmental stage. The first one's sensory motor stage, and that one's 0 to 2 years old, where it talks about the infant knows the world and their movements and sensations, and children learns the world through basic actions like sucking, grasping, looking, and listening. And they learn that things continue to exist even though they cannot be seen. That's one of the interesting things about that stage.
Yeah, right.
Object permanence.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's not a question of doing something right or wrong. It's just observing. That's why kids drive parents crazy sometimes, because they want to touch things, and they shouldn't be touching.
Right. That's how they understand their world, by touching things and feeling things. And it's, peekaboo is a good example. But when someone does or doesn't learn object permanence. Object permanence simply means that something exists even though you can't see it. And so that's where that kid, they play peekaboo and it's gone and it's here and they get excited. But around age 2 or so, and this is our rough estimates, around age 2 they realize that, it's still there. And so that's kind of the one. And then in this earlier stage, they acquire knowledge through their sensory experiences and manipulating objects, like you said. They want to touch everything. And that's the way that they do that. Then the second one is the pre-operational stage, and that's 2 to 7. That's 5 years. There's a lot of learning that goes on through there. And so that one's a little bit different in the 2 to 7, and I kind of just want to give you an overview of it, is that they begin to think symbolically, and they learn to use words and pictures to represent objects. They can identify things.
And a lot of times they pick up from their parents words and maybe words they shouldn't pick up.
Mimicking.
They're mimicking and try out things, and then if some of them find out that's not a good way to go.
They find out by soap that that's not a word they should use. But children at this stage tend to be egocentric, and they struggle to see things from other people's perspective. So we know if people sometimes get stuck in a place like this, or they're not developed enough, that very often they have trouble with seeing the world through somebody else's eyes or being empathetic. And then while they're getting better with their language and thinking, they still tend to think about things, and they're very concrete, which is why it's called the pre-operational stage. Very concrete.
And this is before in kind of a real moral sense. I mean, about it's just what's there.
Right. What they see.
What they see. I mean, there's no, and if there's any right or wrong, it's what parents tell them it's right or wrong, and not from themselves at all.
Right. Yeah. It's only things that they learn and hear.
Yeah, right.
Not necessarily their own thinking.
Right.
And so this third one, this concrete operational, where the kids 7 to 11 years old, they actually begin to think logically, and then they can about concrete events, and their thinking becomes more logical and organized, but they're still very concrete. Children begin using inductive logic and reasoning from specific information to a general principle. So they're very concrete, but they can start thinking a little bit outside the box, but they're still kind of stuck in the box.
Right. Yeah. But this is when they can have somewhat of a conscience that I did something wrong.
Right. Or some awareness of that.
And of course, like in terms of confession, they can go to confession for the first time with some idea. I mean, a lot of times they go back and forth.
Right.
But some idea of that they shouldn't have done this or acted wrongly. Some idea of that whole conscious thing.
Yeah. Well, Father, I appreciate being able to kind of talk about this in just general terms and just a little bit of an overview, because I think it helps us to understand how children think and how they begin to change in their thinking. We were able to talk a little bit about Piaget and kind of recap some of those things. Piaget was somebody who did some work in moral development, but there's a spiritual development here that's important.
Right.
No matter what you believe in or who you believe in, spiritual development's important to talk about.
Right, yeah. And when we're young, I mean, there's an outline of whole stages we go through, and from the time we're young, but also in adults sometimes hang on to these stages. Like the first stage is people act out of punishment. So that might mean that. I mean, when you're a child, they say, well, if you don't eat all your food, you're not gonna be able to use your telephone, or not gonna watch television, something like that. I mean, for a child, for a child, but for an adult, it might mean maybe keep something like that for punishment. It might mean that if you don't act right, you can go to hell. I mean, like
the awareness of that.
Awareness of that, yeah. And then I think a lot of people too, they hold on to that and become very scrupulous. And if you ever deal with somebody scrupulous, they almost drive you crazy, because they're always worried about. Is this a sin? Is this a sin? Is this a sin?
Did I do this right or wrong?
But yeah, the right or wrong, because I don't want to go to hell.
Right.
I mean, so they motivated. Out of punishment,
out of that fear. Yeah, and Kohlberg does that a little bit, does that a lot.
Yeah.
In Piaget's stuff, that first he talks about when you're very young, if an object is there, whether object permanence is an issue, about whether or not that continues, and the pre-operational, you start to think a little bit more concretely. As you get a little bit older, more concretely, and then lastly, the formal operational stage is really interesting, when people become much more logical. And they can not necessarily have to be so rigid. So that last stage that Piaget talks about, I think, is where it's important to realize those developmental stages, there's abstract reasoning that comes in. And that's really different than what we've seen before in some of those other stages. It goes from a very concrete yes or no, right or wrong, to be able to think abstractly. And that's different as it changes, as they progress. And so abstract thought emerges. People can be more moral, more philosophical, more ethical, more social, and have more political issues and more abstract reasoning. And I think that's when people, according to Piaget, when kids, and they talk about people 12 and older, kids really start to identify with, what do I believe? And Kohlberg does it a little differently. So I want to talk about Kohlberg and his stage, and I like how you kind of reference that first part, because he talks about pre-conventional, and there are really only 3 levels that he talks about, but there are 2 stages in each level. And they get a little confusing, but I just kind of want to present that idea. So there's 3 levels: pre-conventional morality, conventional morality, and post-conventional. But like you mentioned, that stage 1 is all about obedience and punishment. And some act correctly or they're morally aware when they want to be obedient. Mm-hmm. They want to do it because I want to make mommy or daddy proud of me. Mm-hmm. Versus like you talked about earlier about punishment, and that may stay for a long time because punishment can be something that motivates people all throughout their lifetime.
Yeah. And of course, the second level is because reward of pleasure. And of course, we do that, again, simple things too, we can use the dinner table thing, but is if you don't eat all your if you eat all your things, then you can go out.
Right. You eat all your vegetables, you can go play.
Go play or something like that. So we're motivated by pleasure, and of course, in terms of religion, the same thing. If you be a good boy, good girl, then you can go to heaven, and then you eventually the big picture like that. So. That could be a motivating thing that sticks with people for a long time. In that stage.
Yeah, and for Catholics, very often obedience is following the laws of the church.
Yeah, well, okay, but that's coming up.
All right, I don't want to jump the gun.
Okay,
I don't want to jump the gun.
Okay, yeah. So, if we want to move to the next conventional level, the third thing is kind of the good boy, good girl stage.
Right.
And that's. You'd say, that people kind of realize that if I act this way or something like that, people will like me. Mm-hmm. People think, that's the teacher would say, that's a good Johnny's a good boy, Sally's a good girl, Mm-hmm. And so they conform to doing what's right because they want to be a good boy, good girl. Now that can go into adulthood, and a person can, think, well, this person's a good church person. He's generous in these various foundations and so forth. He's a good citizen. He's a good person, and so. But again, this is outside. The judgment is outside, not inside.
Not internal.
Not internal.
It's external.
External. Yeah.
Judgment of what people think or what you think people are thinking of you.
And then the fourth stage, the fourth level, fourth stage, is you do things because there's a law. There's a law saying, I must, anything. I must love my neighbor. Well, I'm going to do it because there's a law. I must go to church because there's a law.
And what motivates us.
Yeah.
Fortunately, Kohlberg kind of breaks down this moral development as it relates to how people are motivated or not motivated.
Right.
In what they do. And that we talked about the 3 different levels, and there's 2 stages on each one. Level 1 is pre-conventional morality, where people will operate out of obedience versus punishment, or they operate out of stage 2, which is individualism and exchange. Mm-hmm. And they feel like what they should or shouldn't do. That stage 3, you did a really good job talking about good and interpersonal relationships, that good boy, good girl, doing things, and then are maintaining social order in stage 4, becoming aware of the rules of society. But it's really stage 5 and stage 6 where we really want to be, where we want to grow to in our moral development and our spirituality.
Yeah. Let's make one important point, that all these 4 stages are all outside of us.
The first 4.
Yeah, first 4, whether it's pleasure, punishment, or conformity to a standard, or a law.
Following the law.
It's outside of us. And then we make the jump to the next stage, which is the stage that says basically this, okay, that a person decides what he or she is going to do. In other words, I'll say, I'm going to be a loving person because I want you to love me. And so I'm going. It's not because there's a law that says that, but I make a decision that I'm going to be a loving person. I can't control you, but I can control myself. So a person makes this decision to be a loving person, hoping that people will respond accordingly to
in kind.
In kind.
And it says some of the statistics say that only 10 to 15% of people ever really work to that level of moral development.
Yeah, because I think they think once they're following the law, that's it.
Right. If I'm doing what they say I'm supposed to do, I'm good.
Yeah.
And they kind of stop.
Yeah.
It's kind of like my decision to stop learning at 30.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make a lot of sense. I've got a whole lot more learning to do because I need to learn how to be a better person.
Right.
And I need to how to think outside of myself and not be controlled by outside laws, but become a better moral person internally.
Right. And then the other thing too is that I mean, the law is outside of us, and you don't have to embrace the law, you just have to do it.
Right.
I mean, you might not agree with the law, but you say, okay, if I'm going to be a good citizen or good Christian or whatever you want to say, I just have to do the law and not necessarily getting really personally involved.
I don't have to do anything else.
Yeah, right.
It says where aware that what rules and laws might exist for the good of the greatest number, there are times when they will work against the interest of popular individual thinking.
Right.
Because it's kind of an interesting perspective. It talks about that's what Jesus was about.
Right. Definitely.
He didn't go against. He didn't care about popular thought.
Right.
He cared about what was right in the eyes of God.
Right.
And what he knew was right in his faith.
Yeah. A quick example of that is that a lot of times, the lawyers or the law said you couldn't work on the Sabbath, and so when the apostle was picking grain, the Pharisees said they're doing something wrong. They're working on the Sabbath. He said no. That's not the spirit of the law is for the people, for the people, So he jumped into the spirit of the law instead of the letter of the law,
Right, and just a better understanding of that about being driven by what is right internally. And what I know I need to do is right for the good of me and for others.
Right. Well, let's get to the
stage
last
6, universal principle. We're going to wrap up on this one,
before the clock. Yeah,
before the clock runs out.
Before the clock runs out. The last one is use the same example. A person comes to realize that I'm going to be a loving person. I would like you to love me, but I can't depend upon that. I'm going to be a loving person, period. And if you don't love me back or people don't love me back, I'm going to still be a loving person, and because that's the thing to do. That's the thing that God wants us to do, is be all love.
And this universal principle, as he defines it, is just that. It's love. And I'm going to be loving whether people are going to love me back.
Right.
I can still be happy whether people cut me off in traffic.
Right.
I can still be a loving person whether people abuse or neglect or do things that I don't necessarily agree with. The universal law is, and the universal principle is love.
Yeah, and the other important thing is it's an internal decision. In other words, it's not because there's a law saying I must do that I come to that realization that this is what I should do. This is the right thing for me to do, and therefore I have to act on it.
Yeah, and it says that in marriage, you're not supposed to love and honor your wife because the Bible says you love and honor your wife because internally you want to love.
Right.
And whether they love you back in the way that you think they should or not, doesn't define that love for you.
Right.
It's not because of some rule or some guideline. But quite frankly, the Bible helps us understand how to apply that universal principle of love. Yeah. Some final thoughts, Father.
Well, I just think I would like those who are listening to us just to think about where they are in their stages. Now you have to go one stage to the other. You can't go from to level one to level 6.
Right.
But you can think about, well, where am I? In this whole thing, because I think this is one of the most important things that we could look at is our moral development, our spiritual development, that we go from one step to the other to being an all-loving person no matter what.
And that's what we want others to know
is
about love. Father, I appreciate and love what you do. Thank you.
you.
All right, guys, and we appreciate you and want you to ask yourself, are you being the loving person you should be? And that'll do it for us for this self-help segment. Don't go anywhere. A whole lot more programming coming up next.